My name is Martin Lutyens. I'm the chairman of the Lutyens Trust in the UK and the Lutyens Trust in America. Welcome to you all, whether it's morning, afternoon or evening for you. We've had over 250 participants in our webinars up until now, and there's over 300 today. So that's an impressive number, and thank you very much for joining us. Our subject today is the British School at Rome. And I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the two panelists who will be giving the presentation today. The building itself was designed by Edwin Lutyens in 1911 for the International Fine Arts Exhibition in Rome. And it represents an important milestone in his career, where he was transitioning from primarily houses for private individuals and moving into the public sector, of which this building is an example. Today, the British School is a thriving research institute in the fields of art, architecture, humanities, and social services. Your panelists, there are two of them. The first is Stephen Milner. He's the director of the British School, and he has multiple qualifications and academic backgrounds, too many for me to list here, and he has many achievements, mostly to do with Italian history, including such luminaries as Machiavelli and the Medicis, Boccaccio, and many others. So thank you, Stephen, for letting us talk about your building today and for being one of the panelists. The second panelist is Hugh Hubert of the RIBA, and he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. He's an architect and a director of Adam Architecture and Adam Urbanism, and his work covers the whole spectrum of architecture today, from master planning of major urban situations and new buildings, restorations, and much else in multiple countries. He's also a trustee of the Prince's, that's Prince Charles's Foundation, and he's the chairman of the Art Workers Guild and other bodies here in the UK. And he has actually lived and worked in the British School at Rome, including working on restoration of various parts of it. I'd also like to mention my son, Marcus, who is behind the scenes enabling this webinar to happen. And if anything goes wrong with it, I'm hoping that he will put it right. At the end, he will also be fielding and feeding questions from the audience to the panelists. And if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A tab on your screen. The last thing I'd say is that the webinar today will be recorded, and you'll be able to view it on YouTube along with the other webinars that we've been running. And that is all I need to say, I think. At this point, therefore, I'd like to hand straight over to Stephen Milner to start the talk.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm hoping that the screen is sharing for everybody at this point, so we can actually see the presentation. It's obviously for me as current director of the BSR, it's a great honour to be invited to partake in this particular webinar, and I'd like to thank Hugh in particular for approaching me and asking me whether I'd be willing to bookend the presentation today. I just wanted to say just a few words about the British School by way of context, and then towards the end of the talk I was going to look a little bit at the most recent restoration that we completed of the facade last year, precisely on the 150th anniversary of Lutyens' birth, by pure happenstance, but happy coincidence. So the British School was founded in 1901 predominantly as an institute for the research of classical archaeology, and gained its first royal charter in 1912 in the immediate aftermath of the Esposizione Internazionale, which Hugh will be talking about, that was the kind of catalyst, in a sense, for the construction of what was then a temporary, in contemporary architectural terms, a pop-up, I think we would probably say, for the international exposition to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Italian nation state. And architecture was very much a key part of that foundation and of the Royal Charter in 1912. And I've actually got a copy of the original College Charter Act of 1871 with the draft of the 29th of March 1912. And we can see that on it, the seal of the Common Seal of the Royal Institute of British Architects was affixed to that Royal Charter, which I think symbolises the kind of centrality of architecture for the history of the institution. And in fact, the foundation and the suggested nominated names of the individuals who were identified to be on the initial faculty of architecture of the school from 1912 onwards is really a who's who of architects of that period in the UK. Reginald Bloomfield, William Richard Letherby, Lutyens himself was there, together with Sir Robert Stoddart Lorimer, Ernest Newton, Charles Herbert Riley, John William Simpson, Leonard Aloysius Scott Stokes, and last but not least, Sir Aston Webb, were all individuals who were kind of nominated to be on the initial faculty of architecture. So let me try and move the first slide on. Sorry. Oops. Next slide. Ecco. So here are a few, I mentioned briefly the Esposizione Internazionale, and we can see the temporary construct that's there that then became subsequently the building itself when it was consolidated from 1912 onwards. And we can see how, and this is one of my favourite anecdotes, and I hope I'm not stealing Hugh's thunder here, that there was discussion in Parliament about the building of this institution, and an objection was made that we were building a building in the middle of a field, that we were not in the heart of the city, to which came the robust response that Rome will come to us. And I can tell you from the noise of the Pariolini and the local youth in the piazza outside the school of a summer evening that Rome indeed has come to the British school. And these kind of images from the early years are no longer the case. We're very much surrounded by a residential area with limited greenery in front of us across the Valle Giulia. But the interior remains recognisably similar. In fact, the very room that I'm sitting in now, you can see the bookcase in the photograph on the top left-hand corner, and the entrance hall, which we've actually just had, and here's a very recent photograph that not even many of the members of staff have seen, because we've just had it redecorated over the last 2 weeks, the last fortnight. So the interior is kind of recognisably similar to the original building. So the school has passed through history, and history has passed by and through the school, and it's very much a kind of living organism. So I've seen two lovely pictures from our impressive photographic archive of the institution, waving goodbye to Chamberlain in 1939, and then for our American participants, a lovely American gun emplacement with the British School in the background from 1944. And in more modern times, moving forward, one of my predecessors who had an interest in photography took these photographs of the riots that were on the Via Gramsci and in the Piazza Winston Churchill in front of the school steps there in 1968. And then the kind of activities that we like to see happen with the school, combining our architects with our fine arts fellows to do events which actually feature the building in terms of how things are kind of choreographed and used for exhibitions. So it's still very much a kind of alive entity. We're a bustling and busy community, but we're currently in the middle of the COVID-19 shutdown. So I think this is the first time the school has formally been shut since the Second World War. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking to be reopening after the summer lockdown, and throbbing once again to the company of architects, fine artists, and humanities and social science scholars. So that's just by way of a kind of introduction to the institution, and I'd now like to pass formally over to Hugh to talk specifically about Lutyens and the history of the building and its coming into being.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. It's a very great pleasure to be here. I had indecent luck in my youth. I was fortunate enough to win not just one Rome scholarship, but two, and I had 2 successive years at the British School at Rome, during which I was studying the architecture and urbanism of a period known as Roma Capitale. So in 1873, Italy was forged as a state, and that was where my interest kicked off. And it concluded in 1911 with the exhibition, which was obviously the subject of today's talk. And this leads me neatly onto our first slide. This is a master plan from 1873. The backstory is in 1861, the House of Savoy declared the state of Italy. They came down from Turin, moved the capital temporarily to Florence in 1865. In 1871, they came down to Rome and pushed the Pope back into the Vatican, and Rome then became the capital of United Italy, and thereafter began a radical program of transformation. The master plan was a way of regulating that, and unlike Paris, where much of the old city was erased under Haussmann's time, there wasn't the money in Italy to do that, nor was it the ambition to erase Rome's past, because the whole reason for making it the capital was to forge the history of ancient Rome with the identity of the new nation state. Consequently, you can see the new quarters of Rome planned in red on this master plan, and then through the older part of the city shown in grey, there are new streets or widened streets, and the approach was to take the best buildings along those routes and then to create the best straight line they could through them. So a much more picturesque approach to town planning than you might have seen in the new quarters and certainly in other European capitals at that time. Can I have the next slide, please? So as you've heard, in 1911, there was an exhibition to celebrate the 50 years of the state of Italy, and it had 2 sites. One was in Turin, in the north of Italy, the focus of which was agriculture and industry, and the second site in Rome was focused on arts and archaeology. And the slide here you can see is the plan of Rome, by which time in 1911 much of the 1873 master plan had been realised, with those new quarters being recognisable by the rectilinear street pattern you see on your screen there. At the top of the slide you can see 2 sites, one called Piazza d'Armi and the other Valle Giulia. These were the 2 sites for the 1911 exhibition. If I have the next slide, please. This is a more detailed plan showing the 2 sites. So on the west of the Tiber River, shown in the middle, with the pavilions for the regions of Italy, and on the right-hand side, the international pavilions, each one of which was designed by the representative country rather than being designed by Italian architects. And you can possibly see at the top of the cross-axis for the main road is the site of the British Pavilion. Next one, please. So this is a more detailed plan looking at the Valle Giulia site. The old building is a Renaissance villa, the Villa Giulia by Vignola, you can see in the grey. And you can see much more clearly here the Inghilterra Pavilion on that cross-axis on high ground looking across the valley. The low point of the valley is pretty much the road in the middle of the plan. And on the right of the British Pavilion, as you can see it here, is the Palazzo di Belle Arti. And I'll show you that on the next slide, which is now the Gallery of Modern Art in Rome. And just for amusement, a detail coming up now on the next slide of 2 parts of that front elevation, 2 sculpture groups. That on the left-hand side, you can see in Roman numerals 1861, and on the right-hand side, 1911, so capturing that 50th anniversary. The female figures with laurel wreaths are antique victory goddesses. Those on the 1861, you can see are very modestly clothed. By 1911, it's all become a bit more liberal, and you can see that their attire is rather less discreet, perhaps, than the earlier grouping. And this symbolises perhaps the end of papal rule in 1871, and by 1911, it was a much more relaxed and free society. Next slide, please. So in 1909, a royal commission was set up to manage Britain's contribution to the 1911 exhibition. The Prince of Wales was declared its president, and the chairman was the Earl of Lytton, Edwin Lutyens' brother, Victor, and Lutyens was appointed as the consulting architect. Next slide, please. So in 1900, there'd been an exhibition in Paris, and Lutyens had designed this building, which was the British Pavilion, but in fact it was pretty much just a copy of an early 17th century manor Kingston House in Bradford-on-Avon. But nonetheless, at the time, it was much admired as being the most distinguished pavilion in that particular exhibition. Next slide, please. Rather bizarrely for the 1911 exhibition in Rome, the Board of Trade, who took control of the plan for it, instructed that the front elevation should be a copy of the upper tier of the west front of St. Paul's Cathedral. And in 1909, Lytton and Lutyens went to Italy, first of all to Turin to look at the building that was proposed for the British Pavilion there, and then to go on to Rome to go and look at the site of the pavilion for the Rome part of the exhibition. And there was a very amusing letter that Lutyens wrote to his wife on that trip about the long and tiresome meetings, all carried out in Italian, which he didn't understand, and how he amused himself by drawing the Italians first of all with their clothes on and then with their clothes off. Next slide, please. Whilst in Rome, Lutyens was asked to give some thought to what a pavilion might look like, taking inspiration from St. Paul's Cathedral, and this is a characteristic Lutyens sketch on graph paper, which he always used for these sorts of initial thumbnail ideas of the first thought of how the pavilion might look. And everyone was so taken with the way he was approaching this that he very soon after was asked to take on the commission formally. Next slide, please. So the slide I show you here on the left-hand side obviously is St. Paul's Cathedral with the upper tier shown with the pediment, and at the same level I show you the British School at Rome elevation on the right-hand side. And I want to read out for you a short extract from another letter Lutyens wrote his wife about the fun he had with this design exercise. And he said, "The condition to copy, i.e. to adapt the upper order of the west front of St. Paul's, was given to me by the Board of Trade. They thought it all very alike, but it wasn't a bit, which is where the fun came in for me. The whole order had to be altered, and I think it takes much more architectural technique to do this and to make every part fit in with the design of an undoubted master like Wren. The cornice, columns, etc. were altered, the portico and pediment, etc. A great labour, but it was very interesting. To the lay mind, a copy is good enough, but to an architect, except some tradesman, it means a very great deal of thought, insight, and knowledge." Next slide, please. So this is the contemporary postcard that Stephen showed you, showing it in the context of Valle Giulia with the Serbian pavilion on the right-hand side of your slide. And the Italian press were similarly effusive when this exhibition was opened. And one commentator wrote, "The British Pavilion is certainly the greatest success of the Roman exhibition and claims the unqualified applause of all intelligent art lovers and gives to us Italians the best example of what an artistic exhibition might and should have been. Complete in itself and rich in decoration, it impresses and attracts at the same time. It is decidedly English feeling and essentially in harmony with its Roman surroundings." Next slide, please. Either side of the main pavilion were these two sculpture groups. I show you Truth here by Sir Thomas Brock, which at that time were about to go onto the Victoria Monument in front of Buckingham Palace back in London. Next slide, please. The theme in the pavilion was art and sculpture from the 18th century onwards, and the intention was to show the development of a particularly English school of art. And last night, the British School at Rome Assistant Director Harriet O'Neill gave a brilliant oversight and overview of this exhibition and the people who contributed to it and organised it. I believe this will soon be available on the British School at Rome website and or on YouTube. Next slide, please. So here is the plan of the pavilion. The elevation at the front, which you've seen the pictures of, was made of fibrous plaster, and the pavilion behind was made of a steel frame and concrete panels with an asbestos roof with external blinds. There was huge concern about fireproof construction after a horrific fire at the Brussels exhibition a few years before, where the entire exhibit had been burnt to a crisp. And this was much admired in Rome, the fact this had been so well thought through on this particular building. You can see a very prescriptive route through the building with arrows showing the direction that visitors should take. My favourite part is on the left-hand side, where you can see a division between oil paintings by living artists and oil paintings by recently deceased artists, with a flexible screen which presumably could be moved if something changed during the running of the exhibition. Next slide, please. The archaeological part of the 1911 exhibition was organised by two men. On the right-hand side, the great Rodolfo Lanciani from Rome, and on the left-hand side, Thomas Ashby, who at that stage was director of the British School at Rome, then, as you heard from Stephen, the director of the Archaeological Institute in Rome of that name. Ashby was a brilliant and rather eccentric character, and you can see the cartoon in the middle of the slide, drawn by one of his contemporary students, showing him heading off into the Campagna on a hot day with his umbrella and his provisions for an afternoon scholarship. Next slide, please. At that time, the British School at Rome, the Archaeological British School at Rome, had offices, which you can see on the right-hand side, in Palazzo Odescalchi, a Bernini palace down in the centre of Rome near Piazza Venezia. Next slide, please. Two other key figures in our story. On the left-hand side, the then mayor of Rome, Ernesto Nathan, who's the mayor in Italian is Sindaco, and on the right-hand side, the British ambassador, Sir James Rennell Rodd. You can see a formidable character just from the photograph I show you on the screen now. In a letter from Lutyens to his wife, he says that he's received a long letter from Sir Rennell Rodd saying that the Syndic of Rome, and he says this is all death head secret, is so pleased with our pavilion, they're going to give the site a valuable one. Rodd wants me to get the RIBA, that's the Royal British Institute of Architects, to buy it and fit it up as the British School at Rome. I must write to Leonard Stokes, who was then the president of the RIBA, to get it done somehow. The RIBA is hard up at present, but they have had some money left to them. So, in essence, because the exhibition pavilion was so well received, the ambition was that this should become the permanent seat of the new expanded British School at Rome. Next slide, please. The condition of this gift of the land was that the elevation should be rebuilt in permanent materials. This was such a striking and successful part of the composition. The next slide, please. So the 1851 Commission in London had been toying with the idea for some time to establish a programme of arts scholarships very much on the French Prix de Rome model. The slide I show you here is Villa Medici in Rome and some examples of architects' work from the 19th century, from architects who then would have had the Prix de Rome. And in another letter from Lutyens, on his early expeditions to the city, he again records, I quote, "Yesterday afternoon we went to the Medici, thrilling, and they, the directors, extraordinarily kind and helpful. It's a wonderful life and tradition, which I hope we can build up here, but I hope with better results. The Germans and Americans are going to start schools too. I'm sorry we cannot start one wide school with one common library." So at that time, other countries were similarly forming research academies with an arts component as well. Next slide, please. It was decided that the new director of the British School at Rome would be Thomas Ashby, who you've met already, and on the right-hand side, the assistant director, the formidable Eugenie Strong. And another amusing quote, a letter from Lutyens, where he says, "Mrs. Strong is in a very querulous and yah-yah mood. I think she thinks our school is going to be too big for her, and she's terrified of the rough architectural students. Why she picks out those ones, I don't like to think." And he says, "I've likened Mrs. Strong to a great retriever and Ashby to a small wild-haired terrier that trots around after her." So that hopefully gives you a flavour of the kind of characters we were dealing with. Next slide, please. Money was tight, and the first thought was to retain the Pavilion Building and to adapt it to form artist studios to form the British School at Rome. Lutyens was from the outset concerned about this as a concept because of the limitations imposed by the steel frame and precast concrete structure, and the fact that some of these spaces were going to be badly overscaled and a very internalized building. You can see here his drawing of the front elevation, just thinking first of all how the design could be adapted and extended still further to create this wrap around the Pavilion Building. You can see the Pavilion Building shown in grey in the middle of the building with the pavilions at either end. And the elevation, to my mind, is not as successful as the earlier design. I think he had similar reservations. And the next slide, please. And this is the plan of that first concept in full. When you can see it's rather internalized with a lot of rather bland and oversized spaces. So not a great piece of design in many ways. Next slide, please. And that's the front and back elevation, again, just putting it in context. So by 1913, all the 1851 commission money which had been dedicated to the project had been spent on digging foundations for this long elevation and on starting the front facade. And because the money had run out, there was a call to stop work. And immediately Lutyens was asked to look again at the concept and to produce a new design which was more compact. And whereas the first design had assumed that the scholars would live elsewhere in the city, this more compact design would have meant the scholars would have lived in the community of the British School at Rome and be looked after by staff there. So the next slide, please. So this is one of the recently restored drawings that Stephen referred to, showing this more compact design with the portico in the middle, the exhibition hall behind, the library on the left-hand side of the screen, a common room on the right-hand side. This is an upper floor plan, so you can see there's a courtyard with a kitchen in the middle of it with staff bedrooms above, and then a dining room on the right-hand side of the right-hand side elevation, and otherwise flats for the director and assistant director, and rooms and studios for scholars and academic scholars. Next slide, please. Now, because of money, this had to be phased as well. And this next slide shows the whole scheme, which I've just showed you, but with phase one shown in black and phase two in a hatched line on the plan. So phase one was going to include the front elevation, the exhibition hall, the library, and the left-hand wing and the north wing at the top of the plan. But otherwise, it was going to be left like that until later on. And in the short term, the two artist studios on the top left-hand corner of the left-hand plan were going to become the dining room and common room. Tensions ran high. The project was being built during World War I, and I have two more letters to quote to you from. The first is from William Squire, who was the Clerk of Works employed by the 1851 Commission, to Sir Evelyn Shaw, who was the Secretary of that Commission. And he says, "My position here is by no means an enviable one. I have to find out everything by way of Italian customs, bylaws, regulations by myself. Messrs. Humphrey, who is the building company, regret to give me as little assistance in this direction as be usual in Britain. The chief reason, no doubt, is that his knowledge of the language is practically nil. This, combined with the difficulty of getting any tangible results from repeated requests from Mr. Lutyens' office, who's no doubt responsible to a great extent for the present state of affairs." And it was delays were legion, and the project went on for really quite a long time. And eventually Lutyens was made to go out to Rome himself to take charge of the situation. Another letter he wrote to his wife, he captures his mood at the time. "I count the days to be home again. War with 3 committees, 1 in Rome and 2 in England, makes the British school so difficult, and everyone seems cross with me, as though I could help it and ascribe everything to my being in India. Then the Roman municipality with their absurd drainage rules." This was a reference to the Aqua Virgine, which goes near the site, which is one of the Roman aqueducts that had to be built over to protect it from the danger of contamination from effluent from the British School of Rome drains. And then Mrs. Strong and Rod and all, I suppose, I give them at least £1,500 worth of fees, at least. So my journey is heavy-hearted, and little by little the committee, which contains Aston Webb, a delightful fellow, but with no humanitarian taste to my sense, etc., 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 just spoils the building, and so don't save money or use it to the best purpose, and it does not make for lovableness in building. Arthur Thomas, who is his main assistant, has been tactless as usual and puts everybody else in the wrong. Lord Esher is rude and brusque and ignorant. The delay is unavoidable, but everyone is cross, and I hate it. And I can't do anything without sympathy and encouragement. There's a silly clerk of works, Squire, a protege of Lord Esher's, and they give him £10 and 10 shillings a week. Quite stupid and useless. See the little kettle, a sort of kettle your little fish Neddy is never happy in. So it was a very difficult trip for him, but nonetheless he did manage to get people on side again, and thereafter progress was rather better. And it was decided, rather than insisting on bringing materials out from Britain, it was in fact perfectly reasonable to use Italian materials when British ones could not be obtained. Next slide, please. So this is a famous aerial perspective by Lutyens that shows a view of what would have been his second design had it been built in full. And the next slide, please. And this drawing again from his office shows phase one rather more clearly, with this rather bizarre situation with the front elevation being built as a stage set, but with nothing behind the right-hand side, and with that central dividing block with the kitchen and staff accommodation being omitted as well. Next slide, please. And the planting scheme that goes with that rather strange first phase. And then the next slide. A contemporary sketch, which again shows behind the facade what a muddle it had all become by that stage. And the next slide, please. This was Lutyens' sketch for the library, which originally was supposed to be in English oak. Then, for cost reasons, it was downgraded to walnut. And then eventually, the next slide, please. Things got so tight that the design was taken away from Lutyens and given to William Swire. And you see the very utilitarian library on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. In the entrance hall, the exhibition hall, the floor was supposed to have been black and white marble. That was downgraded to travertine, and elsewhere, economy was very much the letter of the approach in terms of trying to save money wherever they could. Next slide, please. So in 1921, finally, the first scholars came. This was the state of the building at that stage. And as you've seen, very much a building in the country at this point. And the next slide, please. Slightly different view, where again, you just see very clearly this very strange stage set, really. In the early 1920s, the first architect scholar, Charlton Bradshaw, was asked to extend the school to create a proper dining hall. The next slide, please. And here is his early sketch. And the design was, Lutyens' design was toned down. So this was the room that was going to go on the right-hand side of the front elevation. So the windows on the left-hand side of the sketch are onto the front elevation. And because of the falling ground, the kitchen was to go underneath this room rather than to be kept in the central courtyard, as you saw earlier. And the next slide, please. And that's the final drawing of the room, pretty much as it still exists today, with the kitchen underneath. Next slide, please. So more than 50 years further on, in 1937, 1938, the east wing, which is now today, was finally added, this time by Commendore Ettore Rossi, under the direction of Charlton Bradshaw. And you can see on the middle plan, the common room I've just shown you on the right-hand side of the portico at the front, and then a room, a wing behind that with a common room on the ground floor and scholars' bedrooms above. The next slide, please. So on the right-hand side is a view of the current cortile in the middle of the British School of Rome, a space much admired by everyone who spends time at the school. Something that wouldn't have been there in quite this way had Lutyens' design been built in its entirety. I think it's interesting, I always thought interesting to compare what's there now with the sketch I show you on the left-hand side, which was Lutyens' early sketch for a project in Spain at El Guadalparal, 1915. It was never actually built. I think you can see very clearly here with the cypress trees and so on, there's a very similar character between those two spaces. And the next slide, please. And another drawing from Lutyens' office, again recently restored by Stephen and his team in Rome, showing details through the central courtyard with a very restrained character of architecture, but very charming and nicely proportioned, as you can see. Next slide, please. This is, it was a contemporary shot. It was when I was a scholar there 30 years ago now, so no doubt the trams have changed, other things have been done up. But you can see that that part of Rome has become an academic quarter with the academies from other European countries clustered around the British School at Rome, but it retained something of that character from the 1911 exhibition. So I think it's interesting, as Martin said at the outset of his talk, to reflect on the significance of the British School at Rome in Lutyens' career, because in all honesty, it's not probably one of his most distinguished buildings in terms of pure architecture, but I think it has significance on a number of levels. And the first of these, I think, was the trips to Italy he made for this commission, were his first trips to Italy and indeed to Rome, at a time when he had an awakening interest in classicism and classical design. And I've got another letter to quote from you from his trip to his letter back to his wife, Emily. He says, "I do wish I could have come here with Wren. All very wonderful, and seeing things one knows so well from illustrations down the little street, and lo and behold, some loved old friend in the form of a doorway, a staircase or palace. I recognize some by their backs that I've never seen. The splendid waste of space in the buildings and the economy of its roadways is the very reverse of what we lay down as right here in England. The lavish space given away to staircases makes me sick with envy. Another thing which astonishes me is the fact a small amount of window area required to light this place brilliantly well." Also, I think it's interesting that he says that he obviously went to St. Peter's and used the opportunity to go and see some of the great sites in Rome whilst he was there. And as we know, of course, later on, his design from Liverpool Cathedral draws very heavily upon the Basilica of Rome as well. At the same time, of course, he was starting to do work on New Delhi in India. And I think his observation is interesting on the urban form he found in Rome, where he said the streets are too narrow for the palaces that stand on them from any point of view. The effect is not really great or happy. He just clearly had expected a much more formal design. So whilst he admired the buildings very much, clearly the sort of medieval character of the streetscape in Rome was not something that he took to his taste, not something he used elsewhere. And in relation to New Delhi, when the Viceroy was in discussion with him about the character of the Viceroy's house, the building I show you at the bottom of this screen in New Delhi, the Viceroy cited two of his other commissions, the British School at Rome on the top left-hand side, and the central courtyard from Papillon Hall, a building which has now sadly been demolished, on the top right-hand side, as being the two other Lutyens projects most likely to affect the concept and character of the new Viceroy's house I show you, as I say, at the bottom. And finally, I think it's interesting that at this time, another letter I'll quote you from, the excitement of the day, this is Lutyens writing again to his wife, has been my seeing Aston Webb, who at that time was president of the Royal Academy, who's very excited about Renelraw's proposal about the British School. He's always talked about the RA in a nice, friendly way. If it comes off, the Rome affair, it will be a great feather in my cap. And Webb says he's never been so excited. So clearly, the commission in Rome very much established Lutyens as someone of interest within the Royal Academy world. He became a member of the Royal Academy shortly afterwards. And of course, in due course, he became its president as well. So, on to more recent things, just to conclude what I wanted to say. The next slide, please, Stephen. This is a more modern plan of the Valle Giulia with the British School at Rome picked out. And after I'd been a scholar there, I was asked to look at two areas for extension. Just wanted to conclude by showing you those very briefly. You can see them picked out in a slightly darker tone, identified at the bottom of the slide. My firm was then called Robert Adam Architects. On the right-hand side of the elevation, a new underground lecture theatre and art gallery, and on the left-hand side, facing on the outside of the courtyard, the new library extension. So just a few slides to show you what happened there. Next one, please. So this at that stage was the western elevation of the west wing. You can see a very simple building with a rather lovely wisteria growing up it. The library had taken over the whole of the ground floor of that west wing at that stage and was bursting at the seams, needed more accommodation. And at that stage, the British School, which is a listed building in Rome, was, on the face of it, incapable of any further expansion because it exceeded the ratio of built volume to land allowed within city planning laws. But I knew from my own research into the history of the building, if you go on to the next slide, that Lutyens had planned on that west elevation, as you can see in his perspective I've shown you before, a colonnaded veranda along that west side. And it had occurred to me when I was living in Rome, I show you on the right-hand side a drawing I did during my time there, if one built that veranda just by putting glass between the columns, you could say you were completing Lutyens in planning terms, and it would create more than 10 years of extra shelf length for the library at that stage. And to my delight, the Comune in Rome accepted this argument. We were completing a Lutyens design rather than doing anything new, and that secured planning consent. Next slide, please. So that shows a drawing of the time with the elevation at the top. You can see on the middle plan the veranda and how it was converted into reading rooms facing onto the garden, and on the bottom of the slide a section through the building to show how that worked. And above that then the director, in this case Stephen, gets a roof terrace looking out onto the garden at higher level as well. And the next slide, please. So here's a photograph taken after it was just finished, looking rather bald. One thing I would like to point out was that Lutyens' early work in a more vernacular manner, he'd learnt from his youth talking to craftsmen in Surrey in the south of England that there's a magic angle, as he called it, for clay tile roofs. And the magic angle is 54 3/4 degrees. And not only does that angle work well for shedding water and snow from clay tile roofs in the British climate, but the resultant angle when you get two planes on a hipped roof is a 45-degree angle. So all the carpentry angles for carpenters building the roof are a simple 45-degree saw cut. And so he always thought that was a wonderful piece of geometry and something he kept throughout his life. And if you went as a student into his office, you were given one of these set squares on day one. And not only did he use that for the roofs of his vernacular architecture, but his cornice projections, which are normally 45 degrees in classical architecture, in Lutyens' version of classical architecture were always steeper. And so the cornices on this library extension are at 54 3/4 degrees, again, hopefully picking up something of the particular character of Lutyens in this design. Next slide, please. So this is a more recent design. The ambition was very much to try and make the extensions fit in with the original character in the same way that Charlton, Bradshaw and Ettore Rossi had similarly just fitted in as best they could with the concept of the original building. Next slide, please. So here is a shot from 1990. The elevation had not been restored at that point, and it had all become rather scruffy. And the next slide, please. You can see on the right-hand side a very utilitarian wall, a retaining wall with raised ground behind it, and a service entrance. And the other loophole we found in Roman planning was that underground buildings were much easier to get planning permission for. And so because there was an entrance here already, we thought perhaps we could dig back into the ground and put an auditorium at the side of the British School at Rome, and then use that with its own entrance onto the piazza for events. Next slide, please. So going back to the sketch I showed you at the outset of this talk, you can see on the right-hand side of the perspective elevation sketch, the idea of a staircase and an entrance to the side of the main building. And the next slide, please. And another similar sketch, he was looking at the British School at Rome at that time, and you can see he was similarly at the same time engaged with New Delhi with a sort of combination of details from both projects. But the idea was emerging of some sort of portone or grand gate at the side of the main British School at Rome building. Next slide, please. So with all that in mind, I went back to Wren's drawings of St. Paul's Cathedral and began to think how one could perhaps take those elements and weave them again into a new way. And I felt it would be appropriate not only to make them fit in with Lutyens, but maybe to put some other clue there for art historians in the future. This was a more recent addition to the building. So on the right-hand side at the bottom of the screen, I'll show you a detail from the Midland Bank headquarters building on Poultry in London, with Lutyens' innovation of the disappearing pilaster of the Doric order you can see on the ground floor there. And so on the portone I show you on the left-hand side, we have disappearing Doric pilasters supporting the entablature over the door, with a blind segmental arch above, with details taken from St. Paul's. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, at that time, planning in Italy, and particularly with listed buildings, was governed by a phenomenon called the Venice Charter, where it was thought to be morally wrong to extend a building in its traditional character, and any extension should be a vanilla, bland, modern box, so we didn't confuse the new work with the original. Not something I personally subscribe to, and I don't think Lutyens would have subscribed to it either. So after a long and difficult meeting with the people in Rome, taking out both my drawings and Lutyens' drawings and Wren's drawings for St. Paul's Cathedral, the final design I show you here, where we diluted the character of the upper part of the design, but the lower part remained pretty much intact. Next slide, please. So this is a shot, again, taken after that building was newly finished and looking much smarter when the whole elevation had been restored. And the next slide, please, Stephen. And then the slide that we showed you on the title page at the front, where hopefully you can see that the entrance to the gallery takes its place on the elevation, but without unsettling the symmetry and composition of the main part of the facade. Thank you very much for listening. If I could have the last slide, please. I did write this little book on the history of the building when I was lucky enough to be living in Rome. There are still some copies around on the internet. I have some in my office if you wanted to get hold of a copy, maybe one or two in Rome as well, but do let me know afterwards if you'd like to get one, and we'll see if we can get one to you. Thank you very much indeed, and I'll now pass you back to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I'm hoping you can hear me. So just to top and tail Hugh's presentation, I just wanted to say a few things about the responsibilities that come with the kind of curation of a historical building of this type. And as I said at the outset, in the 150th anniversary of Lutyens last year, through the necessity of circumstance, because we had pieces of the plaster and cement that were actually popping off the facade of the building as a consequence of rust and water getting into some of the metalwork and the steel and the iron rods that were actually in the columns. We were actually constrained to undertake a detailed restoration project. A work which seems to be necessitated every 25 years or so. So I think the last time that a repainting and restoration work was done on the facade was back in 1993. So I just wanted to see whether we can play you a little video about that process. We're delighted this evening to be bringing to a conclusion the work that's been undertaken for almost a year now in terms of the restoration project. Consolidation of the historical facade of the British School at Rome. It's fantastic that it's coincided by happenstance with the 150th anniversary of the birth of Sir Edwin Lutyens, who was the architect responsible.
The facade was designed by Edwin Lutyens and is based on the second tier of St. Paul's Cathedral. It's interesting that St. Paul's Cathedral was designed by Wren, and Wren himself was looking at Borromini, whose work you can see in Rome.
We have taken back possession here in Rome of the original Lutyens drawings, which we brought back from the Victorian Albert Museum, where they were being held by RIBA, by the Royal Institute of British Architects.
So the facade is actually composed of prefabricated concrete decorative elements and plaster rod masonry. And then we had to clean the reinforcing bars that were exposed, treat them with an anti-corrosion protection. And then we did a pressure washing of the whole facade with water, and then an anti-algae and anti-mold agents to make sure that all of the organic material was gone.
È stata realizzata su tutta la facciata una tinteggiatura con una tinta a calce, dopodiché è stata eseguita questa velatura con un'acqua di calce e pigmenti naturali ed è stato passato un protettivo per preservare questo colore a lungo nel tempo.
The future is bright. We are looking forward to seeing the facade revealed in all its illuminated glory, and we are keen to put our best face forward in what can be seen as otherwise dark times, with a determination to continue shining brightly amongst the darkness and evidencing the brilliance of the activities that take place in the school. So I'll show you just a few slides as we come to the end of the process, which is relatively rapid in terms of the actual work being undertaken. But the extent of the kind of structural scaffolding that was required to undertake the work. We, as with Lutyens, it's interesting looking back at his minute books as to the struggles, specifically around the issue of the drains, as mentioned by Hugh, the struggles that we had with the superintendents, or the discussions, let's say, and in terms of the insistence on using historical methods, so that basically using a line-based paint for the facade, and making sure that where we were doing restoration work, that we use the faux travertine effect in terms of the actual finish to make sure that it was kind of consonant with what was there previously. And we can see the various stages of the kind of the undercoating before the actual finishing of the painting by Stefania. And here's the team to which we owe a great debt of thanks, who kind of led on that work, with the two restorers on the far right, and Stefania, who did the whole of the painting, insisted on doing the whole of the painting herself manually to ensure equality of kind of distribution and pressure and colour of the facade. So it's a fantastic job that was done by all of them in timely fashion on this occasion in terms of the project delivery. And then we had a marvellous celebration of the kind of lighting up of the restored facade. And that was one of the things that I was quite insistent on, that for the first time I wanted there to be a sympathetic lighting project, so that the school was actually visible across the valley, because I think that its symbolic presence and the visibility of the facade and its sympathetic lighting, and given the perspective, and it's interesting to hear Hugh complaining about the cramped nature of the large-scale neoclassical buildings in Rome that really didn't have sufficient sight lines on them to deliver their grandeur, but the BSR benefits from the fact that it does have that across the valley, as was apparent from one of Hugh's earlier slides. So there was dancing and festivity on the portico. We had a photographic exhibition which featured some of the images of the school through the years since its installation. And the effect now, and the way that the school is looking now to the external audience driving past of an evening, is dramatic. It's very present. We're incredibly pleased with the work that we've been done, and also the care that we're taking in the actual curation of the building, and looking both into the work we're doing, but also out to the community of the other academies that live within the valley as an important part of that community. So our facade and our building is in very good shape. It's in very good hands, and here you can see me stood with our current Chair of Council, Mark Getty, and the photo on the right was actually taken on the evening of the opening by Mark. So that really is a Getty image in the absolute proper sense of the term, and I hope if he's listening he doesn't mind me sharing it with you all. So to conclude, I just wanted to say that we are currently looking to put together a project. We started restoring the Lutyens drawings, which have been brought back to Rome, as I said, and here are some of those drawings. There are still more to be restored. And we've also managed to restore the minute books of the building subcommittees, which have the kind of narratives and the minutes of the meetings, of the dramas that Hugh alluded to in some of the correspondence as well, in all its gory detail. And the plan is to put together a project so that we can produce a kind of updated, enhanced version of Hugh's volume with high definition digital colour reproductions of all of the drawings, and produce something to celebrate the building, its history, and also its future. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending, for watching. I want to hand back over now to Marcos, who will be gestating the questions and taking any questions that have come in through the Q&A function.